I don't care if you have perfect pitch or if you're tone deaf. The stuff we're going to talk about in this video is going to help how you identify and process sound. Hello friends, welcome back. I'm Alicia Ann, a musician, singer, and vocal coach in the Washington, D.C. area. On this channel, we talk about good singers, how to be better singers, and general musician advice for aspiring professionals. Like today, we're talking about advanced ear training tips beyond what you might get out of a college class. Now, what is the deal with ear training? It's treated like this big, scary animal that will eat you alive if you don't train it properly, but that's not the truth. It's not scary at all. In fact, if you think about it, it's such a big part of how we live our daily lives. We hear sounds, we interpret them, and the more tools you have to do that more efficiently, I think it adds to the music experience, the human experience, and helps us live our lives in a deeper way. So for those of you who don't know, when you study music in college, you go through a certain amount of classes for ear training and music theory that teach you about chords, intervals, melodic dictation, which means hearing something and being able to write it down. Same with harmonic dictation, hearing a chord progression and being able to just tell what it is from hearing it. But after you pass a certain threshold, it's not really talked about again. You reach a level of good enough and there's not really another opportunity to train the skill further. As you can tell, I'm very passionate about this. And so in this video, I just want to talk about some of the deeper things I've learned from private ear training lessons that I've sought out to strengthen this skill that I think is so important. So I just want to put out this caution sign that this is not going to be the typical stuff that you hear about ear training. In case there are people out there who have been in similar positions to me where I never felt challenged in ear training classes and I wanted to push myself to see where my limits were and how far you could possibly go with training your ears. If that sounds like something you're into, then this video is for you. The first thing I want to talk about is internal versus external processing. What this means is basically your ability to communicate in standard ways, the ways that we have been taught that we're supposed to communicate music, versus your internal subconscious of how you process and internalize music. This is a conversation that works in tandem with it's very popular right now, the neurotypical versus neurodivergent kinds of people, which I have some thoughts about. I don't want to get into it in this video, but for the sake of this conversation, those are the words I'm going to use. Neurotypical would be going with the external way of communicating, and the neurodivergent would be the internal way of communicating. To help illustrate my point, I want to tell a story. When I was in college, as I've mentioned, I sought out advanced ear training lessons to improve this skill. In my very first lesson, we did a sort of diagnostic test where she would play a series of things and ask me to identify it right there off the bat, just coming out of my mouth, this is what you're playing, this is what I'm hearing, kind of thing. It was just to figure out where I was and what we needed to work on through our semester or year. I actually did very well with the diagnostic test. She actually told me that she doesn't know very many people who have the kind of ears that I have, and that felt really good to hear. However, the very next week we got to work and we found out very quickly that my ability to communicate what I'm hearing is very different when I'm just speaking it versus when I have to write it down or go through different steps to communicate what I'm saying in a way that makes sense to other people. For example, she might play something like this and then ask me to identify the intervals that I heard starting from the bottom to the top, and then sometimes starting from the middle note, or then starting from the top. You get the idea. So there's a lot of steps going on in nanoseconds. As all musicians, this is what we do when we hear sound and then interpret it. In this example, you hear the sound, you interpret the sound, you can figure out the interval, and then you communicate the interval that you're hearing. And what I found for myself is that saying it directly as I'm hearing it was so much easier for me, because in that instance, my subconscious was coming through and it was just oh, this is what it is, that's that. However, when it was a written thing, we were doing, 15 exercises in a row, and then I write down what I hear and we check it against the correct answer afterward, I had to go through some extra steps. I was hearing it, interpreting it. Instead of saying it, I was now transforming the answer into symbols and letters that we use as a society to communicate these kinds of things. And what we learned as the semester went on was that internally, I know the answer. Subconsciously, there's no issue ever with anything. Well, not with anything. We all have our limits. But when it came to the visual aspect, the symbols and letters that I needed to use for other people to understand, that's where I fell short. It was externally communicating it in a neurotypical way that other people would understand it. That was my kryptonite, or whatever you want to call it. Like, that's what I needed to work on. So we spent weeks on not identifying sounds, but on transferring that into the way that the rest of the world communicates. So do some experimentation and figure out if your issue is being able to hear the interval, or if it's writing it in a way that the rest of the world uses. And if that's your issue, you have two avenues you can kind of go down. You can work on the skill of being able to communicate the way that the rest of the world uses, or you can figure out a way to explain what you're hearing, whether you want to use shapes, numbers, symbols, pictures, whatever the case may be, but going away from the beaten path, so to say, and going down your own way of strengthening the skill and not worrying about the external communication. The next thing I want to talk about is mapping music in the mind's eye. Whether you figure out that it's external or internal processing, either way, your mind's eye and how you map out music is going to affect both of those ways of processing. Whether I'm hearing an interval or a chord or a melodic line or multiple melodic lines, I'm always mapping it in my mind's eye. This means that internally, I'm hearing the music and placing it on a plane where I see it in my musical processing. This is a very abstract concept. I feel like I haven't heard other people talk about it. I'll try to illustrate it a little bit so that we can get on the same page. So this is a very simplified version of what's actually going on inside my little brain, but I see a graph. Now, it's not a two-dimensional graph like this one. It's a 3D kind of graph in my mind's eye, but I'm not an artist, so this is what we're going with. When I hear a chord, the notes are automatically placed on this graph for me in my brain. Then I hear another chord, and these notes are automatically placed on the graph as well. The color tends to stay the same, but the shape, whether it's a circle, triangle, square, octagon, like weirder shapes that don't have names, those tend to change based on the timbre of the instrument or voice or whatever is the sound. My theory is that people with relative pitch can move these pitches in relation to each other. People with perfect pitch, their graph stays the same all the time, it's unmoving. For people with relative pitch, it might even be the axis and everything, like that moves up and down depending on where you're hearing the notes. People with perfect pitch, this is anchored down no matter what, this is where the relationships are going to be. And the other thing is, again, just my theory, no one's ever told me this, but I don't think that this is a binary issue. It's not that you have perfect pitch or you don't. I think that people with relative pitch, where their entire graph moves, they can train the graph to get closer and closer to the anchor. So consciously mapping out what you hear in your mind's eye on paper like this is a good place to start with becoming more conscious of this graph that's, I think, is inside all of our brains. If this idea of a graph inside your mind is a comfortable thought for you, like it just makes sense and you want to run with this idea, some things you can do is make this graph, like I said before, three-dimensional, give the notes depth. You can also give it colors and textures, as I've mentioned. And in fact, the more characteristics that you can give notes in general in relation to each other, but then also independent of each other, is another way to train your ears in a deeper way. Maybe you can think of characteristics that I haven't even mentioned here. Leave them down in the comments. Give us ideas about how to deepen our own music experience. Even if you think it's a weird idea or it doesn't make sense, like what I'm saying right now, I understand is like, not a lot of people think this way. I don't think, because no one talks about it. And if we're all on the same page about this, let's talk about it. But anyway, I digress. Let's get on to my next point. After talking about all that weird, deep stuff, let's bring the conversation up a little bit and talk about something that's a little bit more common, and that is vertical versus horizontal listening. When you're given an ear training exercise, there's a couple different ways to think about it. You can listen to it vertically, which means you're listening up and down. If you have multiple lines, this can be useful because you can measure intervals and distance and rhythms, things like that, against each other in relation to what you're hearing, again, up and down. However, if you want to get deeper with your ear training, I find that vertical listening is extremely limiting. At least for me, it slows me down because music doesn't happen in an instant. It's happening kind of like a painting. So what I prefer to do is horizontal listening. With horizontal listening, you're listening in gestures and phrases, going left to right and not up and down. This is helpful because you're gathering more information at once. Now, again, if you have multiple lines going on that are vertical, you're stretching it maybe a little bit diagonal because you have to process up and down, but then also horizontally, and you have to choose which one to give more of your attention. Again, for me, this is mostly going to be horizontal. This is also a concept that is talked a lot about with composers and writing your own music. Are you someone who writes thinking about the chords and what's happening in checkpoints, so to say? Or do you write with lines that are more melodic and moving instead of thinking in blocks? Even if you're not a composer, listen to someone else's music and try to get inside their brain and see when you listen to their music if it sounds like they were writing it horizontally this way or vertically this way. Most of the time there's not a clear-cut answer, and with most good composers there will be a combination of both, but it's a good exercise to just become aware of. And this is especially important if you're a teacher. With beginners in particular, they tend to listen more vertically because it takes a lot of brain power at the very beginning to play music. But that's why it's important to incorporate other ways of learning music so you can speed up their horizontal processing as well to make them a more well-rounded musician. And then next up, we have non-tonal exercises. This just kind of makes sense when you get to a certain point in your ear training, you'll eventually want to divert from something that's predictable. Like if it's in a certain key, then relationally it's a lot easier to hear what's going on. So you'll want to get farther and farther away from having a point of reference to train your ears how to figure out something when you have nothing, no point of reference at all. Now I also want to point out here that there's a big difference between non-tonal music and atonal music. And the reason composers might want to write in either of these styles is because having tonal centers can limit them in what they can express. So how do you decipher non-tonal ear training exercises? There's a lot of ways to go about this. When I first started doing it, my instinct was to listen to the intervals. And so I start at one note, then you go to the next one, and from that one you go to the next one, and you notate what you're hearing that way. But I found it was very, very slow because, again, you're just going a couple notes at a time. And what my teacher explained to me is that even with non-tonal music, even if literally everything is so random, there's no rhyme or reason, haha, pun intended, there are still threads of, for a second, going back to the horizontal versus vertical listening, as I've mentioned, it slows you down to think about one note to the next, to the next, to the next. And also when you think about it, at that point, you're not analyzing music, you're analyzing intervals. And while analyzing intervals is useful and practical in understanding music, at the end of the day, it's not music. So what my teacher recommended to me that I'm going to recommend to you is the following. Every group of notes or phrases have more relationships than just the intervals, and your job is to figure out how they relate to each other on a deeper level beyond the intervalactic. Did I just say intervalactic? I meant intervallic. But anyway, it's not random or meaningless. Atonal music or non-tonal music is not nonsense, and it's just our job to figure it out on a deeper level to understand it. The last thing I want to talk about is rhythmic expansion. Now, self-admittedly, this is what I'm the worst at. Very little of rhythm stuff has come naturally to me, so most of it I've just had to learn, and I didn't have the instinct for it the way I do with pitches and mapping it in my mind's eye and all that kind of stuff. Now, of course, you can do rhythmic dictation, which you will do in your college classes. What this means is you hear a rhythm and then you write it down, like you notate what you're hearing. And while this is important, I think it's also important to go the opposite way. So start with a written rhythm and then being able to reproduce it either with clapping or singing or on a drum pad, whatever floats your boat. This is also a nod to the internal versus external or neurotypical versus neurodivergent conversation we were having earlier. Knowing which direction is easier for you to go helps inform you of your own abilities. Like I said, I'm not super advanced with natural rhythm ear training, but we did focus a lot on this in my lessons because it is one of my weak points. And what we mostly did was multi-line rhythmic dictation. What this means is there would be 2 or 3 different lines of rhythms and I would have to recreate them with different, I've got 2 hands and 2 feet. You could have up to 4 different lines of rhythmic dictation, and it's a matter of processing all of them at the same time. This can get really advanced because one line, like let's say my right hand is gonna be in 4/4 pattern time signature, and then my left hand would be in 6/8 compound meter, and then my right foot would be in 9/8 compound meter. Like, you can get very deep with this, and yes, there is a beat that still lines up with all of these as long as you're in the same tempo. And come to think about it now, that's actually another step that you could take if you were like a prodigy with rhythms, is to have your right hand going at like 60 beats a minute and then your left hand going at 80 beats a minute or something like that. I don't know if there's anyone on this planet who can actually do that. If there is, I want to meet them because that is insanity to me. Of any instrument you would ever need to use that skill in particular with. Like, I guess an organist would need to be able to process 3 lines of rhythms at once because you have your left hand, your right hand, and you've got the 2 different systems. And then your feet on the bottom pedals usually work as they have 1 line. So that's about as far as you would need to get with it, like practically using this skill. But learning about it has definitely made me a more well-rounded musician, and so I thought it was worth sharing with you. So those are the 5 concepts that I wanted to talk about today in reference to advanced ear training. If you've gotten this far, then the stuff we've talked about today is abstract and advanced and borderline probably doesn't make sense. But I knew that when I started to make this video, and I still want to talk about it so that we can get the conversation going, because this is something that I care about and I want to know more about. And I don't believe that I'm the only person on the planet who feels that way. And again, these are just like my rambly thoughts about it. Maybe in the future, I will be able to like focus in a little bit more on how to say this stuff better, or make it make more sense to the vast majority of people. Anyway, if you made it this far, thank you for watching. Let me know if you have any questions below. So yeah, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.